I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor. And the second panel after our lunch is an uneasy relationship, Congress and the White House. And I have four people on this panel who can help explain what's happening. And I'm going to start to my right. Todd Harris is a Republican media and communications strategist. Next to him is Rob Collins. How many times have you been here, Rob? My third visit. Rob Collins, a Republican political strategist. To my left, Doug Thornell, a Democratic public affairs strategist. And John,
Anzalone.
I was going to say Anzalone. Anzalone, John Anzalone, Democratic pollster. Thank you all very much for being here. We are going to talk amongst ourselves for a little bit and then open it up to questions from the audience. And judging by the first panel, there'll be plenty of questions from the audience, so I'll probably come to you sooner rather than later. But I want to start on the panel, start with John and work our way down. And just to answer this question, which comes from the title, an uneasy relationship. What relationship?
Yeah.
Between Congress and the White House. Describe what that relationship is from your perspective and how it may differ from relationships in the past.
You know, it's like dysfunction squared, right? Because we're living in a time where there's incredible dysfunction within Washington, and people tend to define that during the Obama years as a Democratic administration and a Republican Congress, right? And that was the dysfunction. And when we do focus groups, you know, we hear it all the time. They just, voters just want, President and Congress to work together, Democrats and Republicans to work together. And now you have the Republican takeover of D.C., and so it's dysfunction squared. And they thought things were going to get done. And the real, danger for Republicans in 2018, people think it's Trump, and I actually think that it's much more about Republicans in Congress getting their act together and getting things passed, or they're going to be in trouble on their own. When they're out there running for re-election, for example, if you're a Republican congressman, yeah, you got to worry about Trump and the political environment that he creates. But as we saw in the first panel, people don't think of Trump as a Republican, right? I think they should be more concerned about the fact that they're not getting anything done, that they're not passing things. And I think the best example is Obamacare. During Obama's term, they repealed it a zillion times, 20, 30 times.
More than 60 times.
60 times. And the fact that they basically didn't have a plan in waiting that they had the votes for is pretty hard to believe. And, so they need some victories. They need to win something. And the only thing that basically has passed in Congress was a deal between Trump, Schumer, and Pelosi to avert, another budget crisis and shutting down the government on extending the budget. So, it's dysfunction by their own doing, and I think that they tend to blame it on Trump. But I actually think that in a lot of ways, we can talk about this later, that Trump may be the only one that can save the Republicans for getting their shit together and getting things done because he tends to force certain issues.
So I think the unique, first of all, it's great to be here. This is my first time here, and it's a really great panel. So I think the unique aspect of what we're seeing right now is that, look, in prior administrations in Congress, there was always tension or there was an adversarial relationship between the president and the opposing party. If it was a Republican president, you had George Bush. You had Democrats in control of Congress for the last couple of years of his administration. With Obama, he had to deal with Republican majorities for the last 6 years of his administration. And it's just kind of like, yeah, the Republicans and Democrats are going to disagree. I thought that the relationship was particularly bad, between Obama and the Republicans. But what is unique here is how adversarial I believe the relationship is between Trump and his Republican majority in both the House and Senate right now. Certainly there were some disagreements that would bubble up between Obama and Harry Reid or Nancy Pelosi, but they were very few, and it was typically relatively quiet. Here you've got Trump, and I bet you if you did a scorecard of all of the times in which Trump has insulted a Republican versus the time he's insulted Democrats, there are more Republicans he goes after than he does Democrats. I mean, he has been in a verbal and Twitter war with Bob Corker, who is a senior Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, who is deeply important to whatever we may do with North Korea or with Iran. He has been in a fight with the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell. What's that? He has been in, exactly, Jeff Flake and Mitch McConnell. You have Trump's old senior advisor in the White House, his chief campaign strategist, who is recruiting people to run against, Trump-like candidates to run against incumbent Senate Republicans. And one of the litmus tests is that they would oppose Mitch McConnell as majority leader. This is the president's former chief strategist doing this. He's also someone who runs a website that regularly insults the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. You've got Trump going after John McCain, a war hero. Mentioned before, all of his credentials. He's also someone who has shown incredible bravery dealing with stage 4 cancer. That's not normal. That's not typical. There are other Republicans that he, regularly goes after. And I think when you're looking at, them trying to, an agenda that they're trying to pass, which has consisted of, the big ticket items that the president and I think this Congress has wanted to take on is repealing and replacing Obamacare. That passed in the House after several different efforts, and it failed in the Senate. A tax reform bill, which I think will be an incredibly hard lift, but I think it's more likely to get done than ACA repeal, mainly because I believe that House Republicans and Senate Republicans heading into re-election need to pass tax reform to demonstrate to their base that they can get something done. Not passing tax reform would be a very damaging policy misstep on their part. And then also you obviously have things like infrastructure, immigration. These are issues that potentially might have more bipartisan support, but there hasn't really been an effort by the administration to do much from a bipartisan standpoint. I do a lot of work on tax reform, and one of the things that has been, that I've noticed is that they're approaching tax reform in somewhat the same way they approached healthcare. They're doing it through a partisan approach, through reconciliation, which means that they only need to get 50 plus 1 vote. So they don't really need Democrats, and they haven't really been negotiating with Democrats. Jared and Ivanka might have 2 or 3 over for dinner, but there's not a real serious negotiation going on with Democrats on tax reform. And I actually believe tax reform is something that politically could be problematic for some Democrats who are running for re-election in the Senate, and problematic in the sense that I think that that it would be hard for them to oppose. And I think actually a handful of Senate Democrats and a handful of House Democrats want to work with their Republican colleagues on tax reform. So, but I think what is unique is, again, I just go back to just this very hostile relationship that the administration has developed with key leaders that they need to pass their agenda in their own party.
So now we've heard from the Democratic operatives. Now it's time to hear from the Republican side of the aisle, and I would love to get your reaction to, or your definition of, the relationship between Congress and the White House, and whether you agree with Doug that tax reform is actually something that could get done.
Thank you. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for inviting me. I always look forward to this conference. I think we have a lot of great discussions. So at my day job, we have over 60 clients that spend all their energy in DC trying to understand and communicate with their federal government on some level. Congress, House, Senate, the administration, Republican, Democrat. And so I'm going to throw an idea out and let's have a Robert Frost moment and travel the path less traveled, at least today. And let's put out the theory that actually Donald Trump is kind of brilliant in what he does. And for those of you at home, that was a groan out of the audience.
Please explain.
I'm going to give you two analogies, and I'm going to start with one, and then I'll come back to it, so hopefully it'll make more sense. So Kevin McHale was a basketball player in America, and he was in the Hall of Fame, and he was 6'9", kind of slow, didn't have a lot of power, wasn't known as a dominant player physically, but he was considered one of the hardest players to defend. And why is that? And one coach once said, because when basketball players, from the moment they step on the court to the moment they step off, they think of a basketball court the way the lines are drawn. They think this way and they think this way. And Kevin McHale always thought diagonally. So he was very hard to defend because he did things that no other player did in those exact same situations. And he used to drive his opposing teams crazy. So let's put that aside for a second. And let's go to, you look at someone in the legislative arena, and this analogy only works in the legislative arena, not the other stuff that occurs on Twitter and other stuff. But in the legislative arena, what is he most like? Well, we don't have a lot of history with Trump, so it's hard to kind of pigeonhole him in. So the Republicans win everything. He comes in, he's the Republican. It's, we're going to ram all this stuff through, and it's going to be great. And it doesn't work out that way. And why is that? Well, I've come to this conclusion that I'm not sure I can even prove, but let's set up a box here. That there was a legislator named Bill Thomas. And Bill Thomas was a famous House member. He ran Ways and Means, and when he was chairman, all the big legislation moved through his committee. And, Thomas was, when they do these annual polls of members, just in little DC publications, they said one year who's the workhorse of Congress? And he got number 3, workhorse. They said, who's the smartest? He got number 2. They said, who's the meanest? He got number 1. And that was Bill Thomas's reputation. He was incredibly unpredictable. I saw him once make a pregnant staffer with the Bush White House cry at a meeting 3 times the size of this. He once arrested Democrats for having a meeting in the U.S. Capitol, had the Capitol Police arrest them. So he was incredibly hard to deal with. And there's this famous story that he passed a major piece of legislation. And he comes back to his office, and all the staffers and everyone who had worked so hard to pass this piece of legislation were clapping and patting him on the back, and he came in mad. I said, Chairman, why are you so mad? Well, he said, I got 222 votes. And they're like, you're right, it passed. Well, in the House, you need 217 votes. So he was mad because he had 3 votes to give away, and he could have driven an even harder bargain. And his point wasn't, I gave too much to the Democrats, I gave too much to the Republicans. His point was, I gave too much away. It was kind of like those t-shirts you see when people in the airport. It says Detroit versus everybody. It was Bill Thomas versus everybody, and he had his vision for how the U.S. government should pass this legislation. And he was mad that he had 3 people snookered him and got more out of him than he wanted to give. So we'll go back to the previous analogy about McHale, which is, so Trump comes to town and the Republicans come to them, and they've been thinking this way for 30 years, straight, horizontal, and vertical. And they say, we're going to pass health care. And they had 40 votes probably for health care. We're going to repeal Obamacare. And they probably had 40 votes, and they got to 49. Good. They picked up 9 votes, but they didn't pass the bill. But all these people who have been in D.C. and are the experts came to him and said, we're going to do it this way. And so all of a sudden, in the first 150 days, you start to see Trump wobble on the Republican Party. He starts attacking leaders. He starts doing things. And so the question is, you say, is he smart or is he lucky? What's going on? And do the American people, does his base support him? Well, he cuts a deal with Pelosi and Schumer. And the establishment Republican crowd, including myself, were blown away. And we're like, he's dead. The Republican base is going to freak out. So they do a poll. And you know what? The Republican base said, good for you. Tell those Republicans to get their act together. Those Republicans, what Republican base voters are saying, tell the Republicans, get their act together, and Trump, good for you. Teach them a lesson. So, I mean, it's a fascinating time. He said something 2 weeks ago that these late night talk show hosts have really been unfair. And he goes, the Republicans, in parentheses, and me, should get equal time. And let's not get into what equal time is, but essentially my point is he naturally, instinctively, because I'm not sure there's a laid out plan, separates himself from his own party that he's supposed to be the leader of. I mean, it's the most fascinating thing. So you sit there and say the leadership he was a Democrat. So the leadership in Congress that grew up in college Republicans and then joined young Republicans and then ran for office as a Republican and have spent their entire lives building this Republican Party that moves in, very defined lines going against an opposition that started as college Democrats, became young Democrats, ran for office as Democrats. And all of a sudden Trump comes in and he does things that are so odd that they don't know how to handle them. So I guess I would say, well, let's look at his legislative agenda. He was told, here's what we're going to do on health care. That failed. So what does he do? He cancels, what he called, CSRs, which are actually a deal that Congress, for good or for ill, made and the White House made with the American people. But he cancels it on a bill that everyone said, oh, health care is dead. Republicans walked around for months saying health care is dead. Health care is now undead, and bills are starting to move. And you may not like the results or you may not understand it, but Trump single-handedly took an issue that every Republican in Washington said was done. You look at NAFTA. NAFTA started out with everyone saying, well, okay, I had this little thing, and I just want to protect my little thing, all the corporate interests. Now they're terrified he's going to just get out of NAFTA whole hog, and we're going to get out of it. And why does that matter? What it matters is that was the genius of Bill Thomas, is that he would say, yeah, we love what you guys do, but we're going to have to charge you 100. And they'd say, oh my God, I can't have 100. Oh my God, you're going to put me out of business at 100. So right before the bill would pass, he'd say, all right, how about 22? And he'd probably start out by saying, how about 0? But you'd say, oh my God, for 6 months you had me terrified I was going to be at 100. I'll take 22 right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're the best chairman. We love you. What more can we do? And I want to help you pass the bill now. So there is kind of a question you have to ask, which is in all this chaos where he creates incredible moments of leverage by threatening to get out of NAFTA, threatening to destroy healthcare, threatening to upend everyone's apple cart and gore a ton of oxes on taxes, that maybe he will create tremendous moments of leverage that he'll be able to get a lot of his agenda enacted. And then the other part of all this drama that we have with these big legislative tickets, and someone alluded to it earlier, is the regulatory changes we've seen. Sue and settle is something Democrat and Republican presidents have allowed to occur, which is people go to the EPA and they say you're not enforcing a law the way we think you should, and the EPA in particular they will be sued, and so they will settle with the plaintiffs to enact a policy that kind of steps outside of Congress. Well, Secretary Pruitt or Administrator Pruitt just announced that we're getting rid of that policy, and no one has said a word about it. I mean, this is a big deal. So you have all these things that are moving, and I guess that's kind of it's an analysis. I'd be curious of everyone's response, but it only works if he's successful, and that's what we don't know yet. And so that's why it's a thesis that I'm not sure I can prove, and I'm sure it's easy to poke holes through. But it's something that I've been kind of thinking about and trying to figure out as we interact with this president.
I'm glad I'm recording this because that is a fascinating analysis. You had me riveted with that. And Todd, I want to change up the question for you just a little bit, jumping off something that Rob talked about, and that was the poll that he mentioned where, Rob said he thought, establishment Republicans thought, oh my God, the president's dead with the base. And instead they're like, no, you give the Republicans a hard time, tell them to get their act together. And I'm just wondering from your perspective and from the folks on the Hill, Republican candidates who might be running, Republican members on the Hill, how does this dynamic, particularly the way Rob described it, how does that change things or upset the dynamic for members on the Hill?
And I'll echo what Rob said. Thank you all for having me. It's my second time here. I was here right after the 2014 cycle, and it was a lot easier to sit on these panels back then. What it does is it creates a minefield for any Republican who hopes to be a member of Congress, because you've got the most powerful senior elements of the Republican Party actively at war with each other. People keep talking about the Republican base, and as Rob alluded, what is the base going to do when Trump makes a deal with Pelosi and Schumer, and of course they loved it. And the reason why they loved it is because one of the things that the Trump base loved from the beginning about Donald Trump was his penchant for sticking it to the Republican leadership. That was part of what made him an outsider. That was part of what gave him credibility as someone who was going to go to Washington and just blow the place up. And so if, I have a lot of candidates who are running for Senate, and it puts campaigns in a tough position, because you don't want to be in a position where you're forced to choose, as Doug mentioned before, the Bannon choice that he wants candidates to make, which is, are you for McConnell or are you for Trump? And so you're being forced to choose between two factions of the party that despite the press conference the other day and the nice photo op, they hate each other. And one of the reasons why there's so much intensity, I always try to explain this to people, not in political terms, but in historic terms. We fought World War II about 75 years ago, and today Germany and Japan are two of America's closest allies. The Civil War was 150 years ago, and we're still arguing about it. And the reason is because the Civil War was a family feud. And family feuds are much, much tougher to get over. And so this feud within the Republican Party right now, this is a family feud. This is personal. And at its core, look at what all you have to do to sort of distill why is everyone like rowing in a different direction, because the norms just don't exist anymore. It used to be that everyone, if one party controlled all three branches of government, you had a shared ideology and everyone would kind of row the same direction and you would work to get something done. Think about the ideologies of the three Republicans in charge of Washington. You have Paul Ryan, whose ideology actually is ideology. He loves policy. He is a wonk, and he would love nothing more than to sit around and discuss really arcane policy details and make them law. Mitch McConnell's ideology is power. This is someone who when he first ran for Senate in Kentucky, he ran as a moderate. He is someone who has been very, very adept at consolidating power in Washington, and his main ideology, and I don't say this in any way to be ugly, because in Washington, having power as your ideology is a pretty good position. But that's his motivator. Trump's ideology is popularity. There's nothing more important for the president. It's not policy. It's not certainly nothing in Republican dogma that motivates him. What motivates him is popularity. He wants to be loved, and you could say, well, how is that possible? His approval ratings are not nearly where you would think that they should be for someone who was motivated by popularity. But I don't believe that the president views public opinion the way that previous presidents have viewed it, which is something to use the bully pulpit to shape and to meld, to try to build some kind of national consensus. I think Trump views public opinion as a commodity. It's something you own your piece of it that you tend to. You own a slice of it, and you need to. It's like you own your building. You need to make sure that your building is well maintained, and you don't really care about the building across the street. So you have this dynamic now where the motivating driver of the three most powerful men in Washington, they're all different, which is why using any sort of historic norm to try to understand what's going on today, it would be sort of like trying to tour the Duomo with the guidebook from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and like you're walking around like looking for the Chuck Berry exhibit and not understanding at all what it is that you're looking at, because it's a completely separate reality that you are existing in. And by the way, both of them are real. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is a real place. That guidebook is a real book. The Duomo is a real cathedral. But they all exist in totally separate universes, and we happen to have a party right now that is trying to layer all of these universes on top of each other, and it makes for a very challenging time to be a Republican candidate.
Jumping off that, Todd, you were talking about popularity, and I want all of you to jump in on this. This is supposed to be a conversation. And when you were talking, Todd, about popularity, it made me think of the word trust. In the situation of Chuck and Nancy in the Oval Office, getting the president to Chuck and Nancy being Democrats, Democratic leaders, getting the Republican president of the United States to agree to their terms for extension of the budget for 3 months and the raising of the debt ceiling for 3 months, getting Nancy Pelosi, House Minority Leader, calling the president on the phone to backslap him for all the good press that he's gotten on the budget deal, and then actually directing him to send a tweet out to calm dreamers down about what was happening with his immigration policy. And it made me wonder, how can Congress and the Republican leadership, how can this relationship be a relationship when the leaders can't trust, the Republican leaders cannot trust that the titular head of their party will stick with them? We saw it with the healthcare vote. We saw it with Chuck and Nancy. We saw it again just this week with the CSR thing, where he signs the executive order blowing up the healthcare exchanges. Then Senators Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray come up with the deal. He's asked about it in the Rose Garden. He says, we actually helped negotiate it. We're for it. And then as I was flying here yesterday, I see an alert, the president's against the Alexander Murray bill. How can this relationship be saved?
But see, I think this is the problem. I mean, if I was a Republican, that's easy for me to say, right? But I think that they think that Trump is their problem. And what they should be worrying about, I mean, they've always had a problem with the Freedom Caucus in the House. I mean, they've had problems with, cells, if you will, mostly in the House, but, they have their own problems in the Senate in terms of votes. And it's not about Trump, right? So they have the Freedom Caucus, which used to kind of be the Tea Party group, that's caused them a lot of problems, and they couldn't get things passed. But think about the Senate for right now. You have Thad Cochran from Mississippi, who's ill and can't vote, which is a problem potentially on tax reform. You have a guy who might be, Judge Roy Moore might be a new senator from Alabama who's going to hate Mitch McConnell and may just be a contrarian. Then, you have Rand Paul, who's always off the reservation. You have McCain, who just is in a mood to give the finger to Trump, but is using it in the context of his votes in the Senate, and you have to kind of appease Murkowski and Collins on all these different issues. Again, not on Trump, but in terms of the legislation that's coming out of Congress. And then you have Heller and Flake who are up for re-election. That in itself is a problem within the Senate caucus. They've got to get things done. And I don't think that they should be putting Trump in their equation anymore because they're in a desperate need. They could get tax reform done, right? I mean, if Reagan and Tip O'Neill did it in '86, these guys can do it right now. And quite frankly, they don't need Trump. They just need to put something on the table. Infrastructure, they need to put something on the table. They need to start voting on things and getting them into Trump's Oval Office to sign or to veto to bring back. But they need to start legislating. And this problem, let's not forget now, this problem isn't new. They've had control of Congress. And they weren't able to do things at the end of the Obama administration as well in terms of coming together and getting legislation. There are problems within their own caucus and their own membership. Their problem is, I think, highlighted because we have a president who pokes at them a lot, but they weren't being successful in the last 2 years in the Obama administration getting things passed, except for repeal, which wasn't legislation. That was just the easy part. It wasn't putting together how you would actually replace it. And so I think that we tend to believe that Trump is the only problem that the Republicans are having when their problem is within each of their chambers. And that's what they've got to figure out. And they better have agenda because they're going to be sending their majorities out to run for re-election. And in a midterm election, the one thing that does matter is getting things done, but it's also the president's popularity. And so if you take a look at historical trends, if you have a president under 50% approval rating, you normally lose about 50 seats, 50, 53. You could lose just half of that, then the House takes it over. And the fact is, if they
Democrats take it.
Democrats take it over. That gets worse for them if they don't have something to say about themselves.
Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it is for folks who were around for the Bush presidency and the previous Bush presidency. It was always kind of red versus blue, and you kind of put on your jersey, and they keep shipping the jersey to Trump, and he keeps shipping it back to him, and then people start blaming the mailman, and you're like, oh, there's a bigger problem here. And I think that's kind of what I was alluding to is. Trump being so highly unpredictable, he creates maximum leverage constantly, and that's just kind of how he goes about his life, at least in D.C. so far. Now, does he use the leverage to ultimately sign a Murray-Alexander deal? And is he negotiating for a better deal, or is he, his I love it, I hate it, is it designed to extract an outcome? I don't know. I mean, I don't think anyone knows. But I will say, in retrospect, and that's sometimes the only way I can understand how he does things, there was a kind of brilliance in bringing Pelosi and Schumer to the table and making a deal. And at the time, you were like, oh my goodness, he just gave away a debt ceiling limit, but why would you do that? But having them come to the table, as you said, Pelosi call him and he got more done with Pelosi than I think, and we'll set aside the current speaker, but the previous speaker or the speaker before that got done with her in some ways. In some ways, he has a more interesting relationship. I guess I wouldn't say it's productive yet, but he has the seeds of a more interesting relationship with Pelosi than a lot of past speakers have had with her, and when she was speaker leaders. So you look at it and say, well, and also there is it's when you have very clear lines like the Republicans had in 2014 against Barack Obama. You have very clearly defined campaigns. My opponent is for Barack Obama, I am not. Well, and it was pretty easy to draw those lines because I've never voted for anything Obama likes. I never met with the guy. I didn't have dinner with him. I didn't ride on Air Force One. I think someone got in trouble for hugging and kissing Obama.
That was Charlie Crist got in trouble for hugging him.
Right.
And Chris Christie got in trouble
Right. So,
Um,
so you have these very clear, like, my red jersey's not, has no grass stains on it, and then all of a sudden you see Trump just, which would never occur. I mean, like the current leadership in the House and Senate would never think to do this. He just grabs them and says, I'll throw him a debt ceiling vote, and all of a sudden, those lines blur a little bit. And I think that's what I'm, and I wish I had a clear thesis I could kind of just give to the crowd, but that's kind of what I study, and I say he's fascinating from that perspective.
Well, this, and I'm coming to you, Doug. Sorry to cut you off,
it's okay.
but also in your response, talk about Rob's evil genius theory here, which rationally I get it, but I just don't believe that President Trump is this is part of some strategy that he devised in between commercial breaks.
If I can clarify, I never said it was a strategy. It's instinctual.
Okay, well, that's a word you did not. That's a word you didn't
Yeah,
use, but
I'm
I'm glad
sorry,
to know
I'm
that
sorry.
because otherwise, I mean, is President Trump this evil genius as described by Rob? And then how to talk about trust and how this all plays into this relationship.
So I don't think Trump is like any president we've had, but I think if you were to draw a comparison, you could think about Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon actually had what he formulated as the madman theory. It was a theory that, and he talked to his chief of staff at the time about it, and it was related to sort of dealing with Viet Cong, which is if they think I'm going to do anything to end this war, potentially nuke them, then I'm going to be able to get them to the negotiating table. And he actually coordinated with his chief of staff behind the scenes to let certain things leak out about how, like, Nixon's hands are on the nuclear buttons, right? And it was this madman theory, and he did it domestically as well in some instances too. That was an instance where I think, looking back, there was a strategic thinking behind why Nixon did this. I think with Trump, I don't believe. I think he's kind of taken that and put it on steroids, and I don't believe it's actually a strategic. I don't think he's sort of sat back with his advisors and said, I'm going to do this, this whole sort of strategy behind the scenes where people are going to think I'm crazy. So, so when we're negotiating with North Korea or Iran or trying to bring peace between the Palestinians and Israel, that, they're going to think I'm willing to do anything. I don't think they're that sophisticated. I think that, but I do think he is someone who doesn't believe in anything. And so when you don't believe in anything, like, I disagree with Paul Ryan on a whole host of policy issues and Mitch McConnell, but I believe that they have firm beliefs. I believe that Paul Ryan, believes that tax cuts, if you cut taxes, if you get rid of regulations, will cause economic growth, and that we need to, and a lot of the traditional Republican ideas and ideology, I think he really believes that. I don't think Trump does. I don't know what he believes in, and I think the challenge for Republicans and Democrats is that phenomenon with him. Is that you mentioned this, Jonathan? In a 24-hour stretch, he went from opposing to supporting to opposing, and now it looks like opposing a pretty core belief that he had during the campaign, which was these payments to insurance companies were big giveaways and we shouldn't do it. But he went back and forth with it. He did that on DACA, the
Deferred action for childhood arrival.
exactly, the Dreamers. And when he had the negotiation with Schumer and Pelosi. And then there was I think there was a big blowback inside of the White House with Stephen Miller and others who were like, you can't do this. We need to have much more of a forceful immigration policy so that we can negotiate, we can use DACA to negotiate the wall that we want. But I think the challenge for our leaders on the Democratic side and the Republican side is that they're dealing with someone who doesn't really believe in anything except what I believe, I think it was Rob mentioned, his own popularity and what he can sell.
Todd.
So if he can, was it Todd? Okay,
Todd.
so Todd. So what he can sell and how that benefits his own popularity. And so if he needs to essentially keep Obamacare but call it some other thing, then he'll do it. You know, I think if he believes that on infrastructure, we can spend, which would result, you know, an infrastructure bill would be billions and billions of dollars in new government spending. He doesn't, that is an anathema to people like Paul Ryan. Spending, it should, you know, it's something that government spending has been something that Republicans have traditionally been against. But Trump doesn't, you can't put him in a sort of, you know, a traditional Republican box, because I don't think he believes in, what he believes in is what is good for Trump and what is good for his popularity. And that should be very scary, I believe, to Republicans, because I think at the end of the day, and I don't know this for certain, but my gut tells me is that he may not really care so much who controls Congress. He may not care if Republicans lose their House majority. He may not. Because, you know, he's thinking, okay, what in 2020, would I prefer to run for re-election with putting the impeachment stuff aside? Okay, so we know that, but politically, is he thinking 2020, would I prefer to have total control of government with my party running for re-election? Or would it be better politically for me if I had some boogeymen that I could use to put the blame on what's not happening? Or maybe in the event that something does happen, it shows he can cut deals. And so I think that having you know, he may not care if Nancy Pelosi becomes Speaker or if Chuck Schumer becomes leader, because he certainly doesn't really care about Mitch McConnell. So maybe you know, and so that keeps in this sort of unease that he's created. To Rob's point, again, I don't think it's anything that he's actually really thought about. I think it's just maybe sort of, it is instinctual. But it, you know, maybe it just creates a level of anxiety within his own party that they need to sort of, maybe they need to now, it forces them to reconsider their votes on ACA, and they need to get in line, because he cut that deal with Nancy and Schumer right around the time that they were having with problems with ACA. It sends a message to the Republican leadership: look, if you guys don't get your act together, then I will cut a deal on health care.
Well, to that point, Todd, you know, if the president doesn't care, if he loses his majority, what does that mentality, that mindset, say to you as a Republican strategist, but also to your clients who are running for office with a person who's the titular head of the party who couldn't care less whether they won or lost?
Well, I think it's directly related to the previous question that you asked about the issue of trust. I think maybe it's helpful to think about how the two sides view each other. If we were in a room of congressional, if we were a bunch of chiefs of staff on the Hill, or Republican chiefs of staff, we would all be complaining about a White House in chaos. We'd be complaining about a White House that doesn't use its bully pulpit to drive our agenda. We'd be complaining about a White House that doesn't keep its word. And the greatest sin of all, we would be complaining about a White House that can't be trusted to provide any level of political air cover if we were to take a tough vote on something. So you've got that on one side. If we were over at the White House, it's a much simpler calculus at the White House. The White House looks at Congress, all of Congress, including, or maybe even particularly, the Republican leadership. They view them as the problem. They are the swamp. And probably the greatest sin of all, as far as the president is concerned, they are unpopular. The president, I mean, we've all seen his obsession with ratings, with the idea of popularity. So if you are as unpopular as Congress is, you don't, in the president's eyes, you don't have a lot of value. And And so it makes for a dynamic where you think about like, I think Doug mentioned Nixon and Vietnam, in all of those negotiations that Kissinger was involved in, some of the earliest negotiations, it was just trust building. In the earliest stages of any sort of diplomatic action, you start with trust building, and we don't have that, at least on the Republican side internally. And as far as Republicans losing, if you are someone like the president who has called himself the greatest negotiator, in modern history, there's probably a certain amount of appeal to having Democrats be in charge of Congress because he's not tethered by ideology. He just wants to get something done, whatever that something is. And so if you can cut a deal with Democrats and get something done, then you have more bragging rights.
One more question before I open it up to the audience, and is jumping off something John said, which I would love to particularly get the Republican side of the aisle here's response to. And John mentioned the fact that Republicans on the Hill, and I'm paraphrasing here, because they can't trust the president to give them air cover, trust the president to support what they're doing, that they will separate from the president, meaning they will pursue their own legislative agenda with or without the president, but primarily without the president, and then send it to him and basically make him sign it because of the whole, he wants to be popular, he wants a win for a win's sake. What is the possibility that can and will happen in order for them in time for the 2018 elections for sitting members of Congress to go back to their districts and actually have something that they say that they've accomplished?
Well, I would say, on the House side, the House has passed a lot of legislation. It makes it over to the Senate where it dies, but if you are a House member or a Republican House member, there are a whole lot of bills, including, by the way, an Obamacare repeal bill that you can point to and say we've done X, Y, and Z. On the Senate side, I think that there is going to be very serious consideration given to doing away with the 60-vote rule, which would then allow for the Senate to crank out quite a bit of legislation. It may not go anywhere, but without getting rid of the 60-vote rule, it makes it a lot harder. I'm not taking a position on whether the 60-vote rule should stay or go, but it does make it makes it very, very difficult for the Senate currently to get its job done.
Rob?
Well, we've already seen it. The Russian sanctions bill, Trump hated it. He threatened to veto. The Senate passed it with like 96 votes, and he signed it. So, and, I think Trump is, he's so fascinating because he can alter a landscape so quickly. I mean, he has wrapped his arms around things that the traditional Republican or Democrat say you never talk about. You never make fun of a POW. You don't, you tread very lightly when discussing race in very specific ways, and he did not do that. And yet he survives. And, I was in the primary, I was on a different campaign, and I watched him stumble into things that I was like, well, this thing was fun, it's over. Yeah. I mean, from his speech where he descends from the elevator, or the escalator.
Yeah.
And he talks about immigrants, and then he attacks John McCain, and you're just like, this is not. And so, the question you have is, can he fundamentally continue to alter the landscape in such a way, and could he, a week out from an election, turn a landslide loss into a landslide victory? He's probably the only person who could in my lifetime that I've seen who's been able to do this. But also, and we're spending a lot of time and energy talking about how the Republicans have trouble because Trump differentiates himself from them. But the opposite may also become true, which is in 2014, you didn't see Barack Obama on the campaign trail. 2006, you didn't see George W. Bush on the campaign trail. Why? Because their numbers were in the tank, and the conventional wisdom, folks who play this way, say, don't have the president on the campaign trail. Well, at the end of the day, I think in 14, there was a lot of places where Obama could have gone and helped their candidates, but the conventional wisdom is don't have that person. So if Trump's numbers continue to be weak and weaken, and they have, like it or lump it, I mean, there's just too many polls out there that say they have, the Republicans will have a legitimate case that I think the voters will agree that there's Democrats, there's Republicans, and then there's Trump. And I've seen focus groups, I've seen polling where people already instinctively differentiate between those three things, where we've never had that dynamic truly in the American Party. I mean, Clinton that may have had examples where he triangulated or kind of worked against his party, but at the end of the day, if you asked someone, do you think Bill Clinton's the head of the Democratic Party, they would say, yes, I do. Trump, you don't get that answer. So it's a fascinating thing for people who run campaigns, which is how do you run with and against this thing at the same time? I mean, and I think campaigns that do it smartly, and you saw Rob Portman do this geniusly. That's a word. I don't know. I might have just made that word up like bigly, but he was very genius in how he ran with and against Trump at the same time, and it's an interesting challenge, and how you navigate that. I don't know yet.
I'm going to come back to you, Todd. How do you navigate that challenge to run with and against the president?
Well, I can tell you. So I do Marco Rubio's campaigns, and when Marco decided to run for re-election in the Senate, we wrestled with this quite a bit because Trump was at the top of the ticket. Trump ended up winning Florida, and so it was not a given, certainly at the time in the fall, that we should run away from him. But at the same time, Marco had said everything that he said about Trump during the primary campaign. He had no interest in taking any of that back. And so where we landed was we threaded the needle in such a way to play up a semblance of independence. And what I mean by that is our entire message we had a clip of our Democrat opponent saying that he couldn't think of anything that he disagreed with Hillary Clinton on. And so we used that clip quite a bit and basically framed the race in such a way where we talked about how Marco will stand up to Trump when he disagrees with him. We'll take him on when Trump is doing something that Marco doesn't like, and he'll support him when Trump is doing something that he likes. And we contrasted that with our opponent, who publicly said that he was going to rubber stamp everything that Hillary Clinton would do. And voters wanted, and we pulled this question repeatedly and time after time, no matter what was happening in the heat of the presidential campaign. Voters liked the idea that their senator was someone that wasn't just going to be mindlessly partisan. And so I think in the context of if Trump runs for re-election, that my guess is that kind of messaging from Republicans will probably come back.
Yeah, and if I could just add to what Todd said, I mean, I think that's the challenge that Democrats face in 2018, the midterm elections, and ultimately in 2020, which is how much do they present themselves as just opposition, confrontational to Trump, oppose everything he does, versus someone who will get things done, right, in Washington. And I think that, I've seen some polling for 2020 actually from candidates thinking about running, and that question was on there, which is, and this was in New Hampshire and Iowa, the two first contests in 2020, and the question was posed: would you support someone, or would you prefer someone who is just anti-Trump or someone who is going to get something done? And the get something done does significantly better than just anti-Trump. So I think that is going to be a conversation that a lot of candidates have with people like John and their strategists in terms of how do they position and frame the race in 2018 in the midterms? Are they going to be, especially in the districts that Democrats need to win, which are, look, they're not, these are in some cases, R plus 5 districts to D plus 3 or 4 that Trump won in 2016. So, these are districts where they've got to, where it's really important they figure out that messaging, because, if it's just we're going to oppose the president, they're going to have a hard time winning over voters who are just sick and tired of the dysfunction in Washington, and at the same time, if they come across as sort of too cooperative, does that run the risk of turning off the progressive base that essentially just wants that sort of red meat? And so they've got to find, our Democrats are going to have to find that, they're going to have to walk a tightrope in terms of, it's not just the messaging, they've got messaging challenges, but so do we, in terms of how do we motivate, turn out our base who do not like Trump, and show that we can be folks who can be a positive force in Washington and actually get some things done.
John, I think you wanted to, if I am hearing right, you want to jump in on this. And then I lied. Yeah. I do have one more last question to bring it back to the topic at hand. But go ahead, John.
No, I think there's two things. Building on what Doug said is that there was, I think, a bumper sticker going around when Democrats got all excited. They thought they were going to win the House in 2016 and stuff like that. And they said, we're not the other guys. And, it's funny and it's appropriate for now. But that's not a message, right? I mean, we have messaging problems too, and the fact is that, right? 2016 was a change election. At the end of the day, it was about two really unpopular candidates, but Trump was a change candidate. It was a change election. You then had over 60% of voters saying that the country was going in the wrong direction. What's amazing, a poll came out today, I think it was an NBC Survey Monkey poll, that number has gotten worse, meaning there's more people today that say the country's going in the wrong direction than at the end of the election. Well, that's not good if the Republicans hold all branches of government. And again, I will go back to, it's not just all Trump, in that you can't run on what the House passed and punted to the Senate. You're not going to run on sanctions. They need things like tax reform. They need things on infrastructure. They need something to go back so they can say, hey, we lowered your taxes. We made it fair. We took away all these tax breaks for big corporations. Even if the rates are going to go down. Hey, we're going to this infrastructure bill is going to create 1 million new jobs. They need real things for voters to say, yeah, they got something done. Because it is Trump, Democrats, and Republicans, but right now, when we're in focus, you should probably see this, is people are really aware that nothing's gotten done in Congress. And that's a real problem for Republicans. But, as Doug was saying as well, Democrats can't just hey, we're going to sit back and we're the alternative. Because right now, the generic ballot, are you more likely to vote for a Democrat or Republican? It was at 6 to 8 points, and now it's gone to double digits. Oh man, Democrats just love that. But you know what? You have to fill the vacuum there. You've got to fill the void. We have to have a message. We have to have a message. They have to have accomplishments and messages because they're in control. And quite frankly, neither of them are there. I mean, I will tell you, I don't sit back and say, oh man, Democrats are just going to kill it in 2018. I think it's really complicated for Democrats as well. We are getting an assist right now by the Republicans and by Trump, but by no means have we yet really taken advantage of it. Because let's be honest, we're kind of in a lot of ways irrelevant until Trump picks up the phone and calls Chuck and Nancy, right? and that's aggravating to the Republicans. But how we take advantage of that is come with a core message to talk about how we understand voters, how we understand what they're going through, how we understand their values, and we're far away from kind of encapsulating that at this time.
I think I'm gonna. Did either of you want to jump in on that, or I'll just go right to questions?
No, I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. I mean, as you've seen, devolution of institutions, church, party, or actually, attacking celebrity, which you never thought you'd ever see in our lifetime. The parties have suffered, and as a result, it allows the rise of Sanders and Trump, who were not party people, and the party couldn't control them. And you had these blurring of lines, which I'm a big believer in historic numbers, so I watch generic very closely in my world, but Trump can alter that in fundamental ways that I don't think until we have a few more elections under our belt. It's like the Obama conundrum on turnout. Like, he did something to turnout that no one else has been able to do, but it was always, that's why our polling was always so bad, because we could never figure out who was coming to vote, because he fundamentally altered the landscape on turnout. Trump has fundamentally altered the landscape on what it means to be a partisan, in a sense. I mean,
and can I add to that, that what's interesting is that you didn't know who was turning out in 2016. Trump is also an accelerant for us on turnout, and these special elections have been so close because people under 40, mostly whites, suburban women, are coming out, even though they've never voted in a special election. They certainly have no midterm voting history, and they've been coming out and getting these races really close. And that could be really helpful for Democrats, just on an organic level. But what we don't know is the zealot Trump people who, in Iowa, 225,000 people came out that did not vote in 2012. So again, it's a turnout. Who's going to come out? Is it going to be the Republican, or not the Republicans? Is it going to be the Trump zealots who never really participated before but are there for Trump, versus all these people who have to wake up every morning? This is classic Democrat. They turn on the NPR and hear those three dreaded words, President, Donald Trump. They're the ones coming out in these special elections making things so close. Will they turn out in 18?
Right. This is more of an issue for 2020, which you can talk about tomorrow. But no election is ever held in a vacuum, and no candidate is ever judged in a vacuum. And so one of the things that Republicans will be watching very closely over the next several years is how things start shaping up on the Democrat side with your presidential primaries, because both sides are really, really good at learning the wrong lessons. And there are a whole lot of Democrats, many of whom are friends of mine, who believe passionately that Trump is so unpopular that this now allows the Democratic Party to nominate a Democrat's Democrat, someone who compromises not at all on principle, who is a pure down-the-line liberal, and the view is we have the opportunity to nominate someone like that because Trump is so unpopular that, and learning the wrong lesson from Hillary's campaign, they say, and look, we nominated a moderate last time, and look what happened. So the best thing that Republicans, that we have going for us, particularly in 2020, is, and I don't say this to be partisan, because when things are reversed, we step in it too, but the Democrat Party's long history of learning the wrong lessons and acting accordingly.
So this was supposed to be a panel about the uneasy relationship between the president, or between the White House and Congress, but invariably when talking about politics in Washington these days, it always goes back to the president and his impact on just everything. From the way we look at races and polls and the impact on Democrats. I'm trying to judge how much time we have for questions, but echoing Jay's admonition from the first panel, I'm going to give precedence to students to ask questions, but also please make sure you have a question that it is short. And I don't mean to be rude, but if you do start making a speech, I will be rude and cut you off. So, questions?
So I guess I'm very interested in your theory of he's going out of his way to create his actions are all going forward. And then we might see down the line, 3 years down the line, if what he's doing today will have an impact on his policies in the future. And I see that a lot in Latin American politics. But I'm just wondering, what do you think are the consequences that these actions that he has today? Are those consequences worth what he might create in the future? Like, for example, as in, I don't know, like Puerto Rico, and how he kind of generated this mistrust in how the president will deal with certain issues, like tragedies of this extent.
Is this, as Jonathan said, erratic? Is it worth it to get the legislative gains that he's trying to accomplish? So, and your point is, do we have to kind of, break all the China to put the China back together again? Kind of, is that kind of what you're asking? I think the point.
The long-term consequences of the short-term victories of this erratic
ends
behavior.
justify the means.
Yeah.
Do the ends? I mean, I guess if he wins. I mean, I guess if he wins and he gets what he wants. And remember, every class. If you look at the Senate, you look at just Senate Republicans, and at one point my job was to help elect Senate Republicans. So you kind of study the previous classes and say what makes up their personalities. And they do come to Washington with a personality. So the 1974-76 Democrats came post-Watergate as reformers to D.C., and flash forward, some of them still are there, and they're still they still act that way. That's kind of why they ran. So the 2010, 2012 class, very, as Republicans, kind of disruptive and more Tea Party than not. The 14 class, reflecting on that disruption, came as kind of can-do Republicans, and we're just going to get things done. And so Trump was elected because of a distrust, not of party, but of D.C., of leadership. So he's not going to, that's not, so for him, he is, if one of his goals is to be disruptive, the disruption that looks erratic and it looks, it's hard to watch, I guess, from a purely government perspective, a purely, a theorist perspective. He's accomplishing part of that. And that's why when he does things like work with the other side, which if Mitch McConnell made the same exact deal would be filleted, he's cheered by his people. Why? Because he's being disruptive of that thing that's the other guys. And the other guys aren't the other guys, Republican, Democrat. The other guys are those people in D.C. who the American people sent, 06 was a wave election. 08 was kind of a standard of re-election of the president. 10 was a wave election. 12 was a wave election. You could argue 14 was a wave election. So they keep saying, Coke, Pepsi, one of you get it done. And this time they said bleach, and let's see what happens. And that's a hard reality. But so my point is that the disruption is a part of the goal, and he's doing that, and they cheer him. Yes, you're sticking it to my own party. I'm a registered Republican, but you're sticking it to those guys. You're changing how they operate. Now, but two is he's got to have success too, and that's the part we haven't really seen on a grand scale. Gorsuch at the Supreme Court was a success. Some of the regulatory stuff, but people don't go to the polls to vote regulatory. I mean, we made some little subclass thing easier. Okay, it's not hard to run a campaign on that. So he's got to have big legislative success, and that's what we haven't seen so far.
And can I just add that Todd was talking about ideologies and, Ryan McConnell with power, et cetera. I actually think that Trump's isn't so much popularity. He's a narcissist, but that it's disruption. That he loves the contrarian, and he loves the disruption, and he loves keeping everyone guessing. To me, that's his game. And, we would see it in focus groups. Before the election, people would say, oh, yeah, but he doesn't really mean that. He'd do these crazy things. He wouldn't mean it. And now he's president, and we see in the focus groups, well, we really didn't think he meant that. We didn't think he would keep it going, right?
Yeah.
I think every political thing can be solved by a Pink song, right? The singer Pink, which is, there's a great line where she says, you know, Hollywood says I could be a big star, except I'll have to change everything that I are. Or I'll have to change everything I are. So my point is that people in D.C. thought that, oh, he's going to be presidential. He's this crazy guy, and he's going to come and he's going to change, and he hasn't changed, and he's still the disruptor. And I think the fact that he knows that everyone wants him to change, and he's not going to change, and he's just this contrarian disruptor, that in a way is his ideology. I think he just loves that.
Go ahead.
I'll take 10
quickly.
seconds.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't think the ends do justify the means. And if you can take a look at, I don't care if he gets reelected. I don't care if he passed tax reform. I think what he did in Charlottesville was disgraceful. And I think when you coddle and encourage a portion, white supremacists and white nationalists, people who hate this country, and wish the are waving Nazi flags and Confederate flags and spewing things at Jews and blacks and immigrants and women. When you don't take a stand, and in fact you encourage and you play a game of equivalence, that they're just the same as the folks who were standing up to them, that's not. I honestly don't. If you're a Republican and if he wins, that was not worth it.
We are coming up on the time to end, but I'd see there are three questions here. I know the young woman I nicknamed the prosecutor had her hand up first, so because of her questioning from the last panel. But I encourage you, one question, please.
Okay, Todd has just said that the Congress does not have much value to the president. And so would you say that Trump and you as a Republic are concerned over how things might change after the 2018 elections? Is that something you are concerned about?
Thank you.
How things might change in terms of control of Congress, or?
You've said that Trump does not care about it, so would you say does not care about the Congress, or does not value, that's what you said. Would you say you are concerned over the change in Congress?
I am concerned certainly about, well, first and foremost, as a consultant, I'm very concerned about each of my clients and would like for them to either be reelected or to win. On a macro level, I would certainly prefer that the Congress stay Republican. I am a big fan of Paul Ryan. I like him as Speaker, and so I am concerned.
Next question.
Right. I think that if this past year has taught us anything, is not to outrightly dismiss a candidate just based on how ludicrous they may seem. So when people like Kanye West or Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson say they're running for president, you have to pause before you laugh. So how do you think celebrity candidates would affect polling and voter turnout?
They have all the celebrities on their side.
Listen, there has been a byproduct of Trump being elected. And we are seeing it everywhere, mostly in Democratic primaries for governor and for Congress, which is not only, again, was he an accelerant like, I've got to be involved. It's almost like a 9/11 moment where you see all these average citizens joining the military. And I don't want to say that that's like running for Congress, but that's kind of where we are in the Democratic Party, is that we have literally sometimes 5, 6, 7 really good candidates running for governor in a primary and in Congress for primary. So that's just kind of a byproduct. And I think that you're going to see the Mark Cubans, and those type of people say, well, why not? Maybe I'll give it a try, because if that guy was different, I can be different. The Mark Zuckerbergs, the Sheryl Sandbergs, and such as like that. I think they're all going to kind of take a really close look because of just what you said. Well, why can't I do that?
And question here.
I want to tag on to the Richard Nixon strategy of the madman. Senator Bob Corker started something a couple of weeks ago saying that the White House is basically an adult daycare, and it kind of increased a little bit more panic, it seems, that this man that needs to be controlled might have his finger on the button. My question is, the West Wing, you would assume, has a lot of intelligence going on. All of these leaks coming out of the West Wing, do you think that this is a strategy of, well, if the madman doesn't push the button, we should all be grateful and then we'll get away with everything else? Or do you think that it's an actual cry for help from intelligent people saying, this is nuts?
Cry for help?
I mean, I think we won't know the true answer until history writes these books, but I would say this, White House's take on a culture of their boss. Any big organization, the person at the top kind of sets the culture. Trump calls reporters directly. I mean, no, presidents don't do that, and he just picks up his cell phone, which he still has a cell phone, I guess. I don't know, I've never seen him use it, but I mean, and he calls Maggie Haberman at the New York Times. And so if the president can pick up the phone and do whatever he wants, it sends a cultural signal that I can pick up the phone and do whatever I want. So is it, this kind of, it's funny how the wings of every movement have like the little things. So like we had it on our side too, so I'm not being partisan, but the 25th Amendment crowd, they kind of like, it all kind of bubbles back to like, he's insane. And everything, and they filter all their news feeds through like, he's literally a sick person, and therefore, so that's where, you see this, albeit mostly for cable news to kill time, but, discussion about 25th Amendment. But, so I would say that it's if you have someone who, there's two things. We heard earlier in the first panel. You said if you want to send a message to the president, you have to send it through the media. So that's one evidence. That's why these leaks occur, I think, is the primary. Second is if the boss is able to make himself a bigger person by being in front of the media, and that's how we get ahead in the world, and I work for this person, I want to emulate their success, that means I have to take on their traits. So I'm going to start dressing a certain way, and I'm going to start acting a certain way, I'm going to start comporting myself a certain way. So if he picks up the phone and calls the media, and that's how he got to sit in the big chair, then I want to pick up the phone and call the media, because that's how I'll end up in the big chair someday. I think those are the two heavy-duty drivers in that. I wish it was more complicated and more. It'd be more fun if it was more sinister than that. But
I would add a third. I think that there is a culture in the White House right now that, I'll say it in the reverse. I never worked for George W. Bush, but I have a ton of friends who did, and every single one of them said that they were there to serve the President of the United States. And Ron earlier on the earlier panel talked about writing that resignation letter. All my friends who worked for Obama said the same thing. There was a sense that, a deep sense of loyalty, of doing something greater than yourself, serving in the White House. The people that I know today who work in the White House really wanted to work in the White House. And and there just is not a culture there where you are serving something greater than yourself. And when you are in an environment like that, you can always, with political campaigns, you can always tell based on the amount and the sorts of leaks that come out of them. You can always, it is a great window into how the campaign staff and the senior team feel about the candidate. Because when, one of the things that we were so proud of on the Rubio campaign was that there were almost no leaks. It was unheard of to read something that was leaked from a senior level of the campaign in the press, because all of us who worked for Marco on that campaign, we were all there because we believed in Marco, and no one was going to put themselves above that. You just don't see that in the White House today.
I want to squeeze in one more question right here, and then our panel will be done.
In short, what's in store for Republican voters? Are we looking at Republican candidates 2018 and looking also toward, yet look in 2018 who are going to be just propping up Trump? Are they going to be anti-Trump? Are they trying to reinstate Republican values amidst the chaos of Trump? What are we looking at?
It's a great question. I think that I think that literally you could go state by state by state and have a different answer in each place. I have clients who are running in Republican primaries in some states where the motivating narrative for every campaign is, who can be the most allied with Trump, but who can wrap themselves the most with the president. Every one of those candidates is in a red state where when you win the primary, you are in a very, very good position for the general. I have other clients in blue or purple states, and it is a much, much tougher proposition because you still have a conservative base of the party that supports the president, but you are in a situation where the more supportive you are of the president in the primary, potentially the tougher your general election is going to be. And so you have to ask yourself, is it okay for me to win the primary in such a way that hobbles my general election or hinders my general election chances? And that's a question a lot of candidates are wrestling with right now.
We've eaten into the coffee break already, but I want to thank the panelists, Todd Harris, Rob Collins, Doug Thornell, and John Anzalone. Thank you very much.